It was 3:37 in the morning on November 10th, 1918, and the war had less than a day left to live. Lance Corporal Francis Pegamagabo lay motionless in a shell crater somewhere in Belgium, his rifle resting across a shattered tree branch, his eyes scanning the German trenches 400 yards away through the pre-dawn darkness. He'd been in this position for 6 hours, hadn't moved except to breathe, hadn't made a sound. The Germans in those trenches had no idea he was there. They never did. That's why 547 of them were dead. Pegamagabo was Anishinaabe, from the Wasuksing First Nation on Parry Island in Georgian Bay, Ontario. Before the war, he'd been a fisherman and hunter, spending his days on the water hauling nets and his evenings in the forests tracking deer and moose. He'd learned patience from fishing, learned to read weather and water and the subtle signs that told him where fish were running. He'd learned stillness from hunting, learned to move through forest without snapping a twig, learned to wait for hours without fidgeting until the perfect shot presented itself. These were skills passed down through generations of Anishinaabe hunters, skills that connected him to his ancestors and his land, skills that had nothing to do with war. Then, in August 1914, a war started in Europe that had nothing to do with Parry Island or Georgian Bay or the Anishinaabe people. It was a white man's war, a conflict between empires over territory and treaties and alliances that meant nothing to indigenous communities in Canada who were still fighting their own battles against the government that had taken their land and tried to erase their culture. Pegamagabo had no obligation to enlist. Indigenous people weren't even recognized as full Canadian citizens in 1914. They couldn't vote. They faced discrimination and marginalization. The government that was now asking them to fight for the empire was the same government that had forced them onto reserves and banned their traditional practices. But Pegamagabo enlisted anyway, walking into a recruitment office in Parry Sound in August 1914, barely 2 weeks after war was declared. He was 23 years old, stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, and could shoot a rifle better than anyone the recruiting sergeant had ever seen. Why did he enlist? The historical record doesn't give us his thoughts, doesn't tell us what he was feeling when he signed the papers. Maybe he wanted adventure. Maybe he needed the money, military pay being better than what a fisherman could make. Maybe he believed the recruiting posters that said this was a war for freedom and democracy, not yet understanding that those words meant different things for white Canadians than they did for Indigenous people. Or maybe, like many Indigenous soldiers who would enlist in both world wars, he wanted to prove that his people were as brave and capable as any others, that they deserved respect and recognition that Canadian society refused to give them in peacetime. Whatever his reasons, Pegamagabo joined the 1st Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force, and shipped out to England in September 1914. The training was basic and rushed. Britain desperately needed men at the front and wasn't interested in lengthy preparation. Pegamagabo learned to march in formation, to follow orders, to maintain his equipment, but he already knew how to shoot. The Army rifles were different from his hunting rifle back home, heavier and designed for different purposes, but the fundamentals were the same. Breathe slowly, squeeze the trigger gently, account for wind and distance, wait for the moment when everything aligns. He'd been doing this since he was old enough to hold a rifle, learning from his father and grandfather, practicing until shooting became instinct rather than conscious thought. The 1st Battalion arrived in Fille-Rideaux, France, in February 1915, and went into the trenches near Ypres in Belgium. Pegamagabo got his first look at modern warfare and realized immediately that nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. The Western Front was a nightmare of mud and barbed wire and constant artillery bombardment. Men lived like rats in trenches that flooded with every rain. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of unwashed bodies and rotting corpses and poison gas and latrine pits that never got far enough from living areas. Lice infested everyone's uniforms. Rats grew fat on the dead. Disease killed as many men as bullets. But Pegamagabo adapted faster than most soldiers because he had skills that urban volunteers didn't possess. He could read terrain and understand how to use it for cover and concealment. He could move quietly even through the debris and wreckage that littered no man's land. He could estimate distances by eye with accuracy that officers found remarkable. And most importantly, he could shoot with a precision that separated him from ordinary infantry. After his first few weeks in the trenches, his commanders noticed that whenever Pegamagabo fired his rifle, Germans died. He didn't waste ammunition. He didn't shoot at random movement or vague shapes. He identified specific targets, calculated the shot, and killed efficiently. His first confirmed kill came in March 1915 during a German attack on the Canadian trenches. Pegamagabo was positioned in a forward listening post when he spotted a German officer directing troops about 300 yards away. The officer was visible for perhaps 5 seconds, standing to point toward Canadian positions. Pegamagabo aimed, compensated for the slight wind coming from his left, and fired once. The German officer fell. Pegamagabo worked the bolt, ejected the empty casing, chambered another round, and resumed watching. He didn't celebrate or feel elation. He just killed a man, ended a human life. But he couldn't afford to think about that. This was war. Killing was the job. He could process the morality of it later, if he survived. The commanders quickly recognized what they had in Pegamagabo and began using him as a scout and sniper, roles that required soldiers who could operate independently in no man's land, gathering intelligence and eliminating key German targets. This suited Pegamagabo perfectly. The regimented structure of army life, the constant orders and formations and inspections, all of that chafed against his independent nature. But scouting and sniping gave him autonomy. He could use his hunting skills, could make his own decisions about when to move and when to wait, could apply traditional Anishinaabe knowledge that had nothing to do with British military doctrine, but everything to do with survival and success in hostile territory. He developed his own methods, techniques that combined traditional hunting practices with what he learned about the specific conditions of trench warfare. He'd studied German positions for days before taking a shot, learning the routines and patterns, identifying where officers appeared and when guard changes happened and which positions had the best visibility. He'd move into no man's land before dawn, crawling through mud and shell craters and wire obstacles, finding positions that gave him clear sight lines while keeping him concealed. Then he'd wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for entire days, lying motionless in freezing water or scorching sun, watching for the moment when a target presented itself. The waiting was the hardest part for most soldiers, the psychological burden of lying still under threat of death while nothing happened. But Pegamagabo had learned patience from fishing, those long hours on Georgian Bay waiting for nets to fill or lines to pull. He knew how to quiet his mind, how to stay alert without becoming anxious, how to let time pass without frustration. This mental discipline gave him an enormous advantage. German soldiers would eventually relax their guard, would make small mistakes like standing up in a trench or lighting a cigarette or checking a map without adequate cover. And when they made those mistakes with Pegamagabo watching, they died. His kill count began to accumulate, 10 confirmed kills by summer 1915, 20 by autumn, 30 by the end of the year. Each number represented a human life ended, a German soldier who'd had his own story and family and reasons for being in this war. Pegamagabo understood this. He wasn't a psychopath who enjoyed killing. He was a professional doing a necessary job in a war he hadn't started, but was determined to survive. Still, the weight of those deaths accumulated in his mind, creating a burden that would stay with him long after the war ended. The Second Battle of Ypres in April and May 1915 was Pegamagabo's first major engagement. The Germans used poison gas for the first time on the Western Front, releasing chlorine from cylinders and watching it drift across no man's land toward French and Canadian positions. Pegamagabo was in a forward position when the gas attack came, saw the greenish-yellow cloud rolling toward him, understood immediately that this was something new and deadly. He soaked his handkerchief in urine, an improvised gas mask that British troops had learned would neutralize chlorine, and held it over his face while continuing to observe German positions through watering eyes. The gas broke French colonial troops who fled in panic, creating a massive gap in the Allied line. German infantry advanced behind the gas cloud, expecting to find dead or incapacitated defenders. Instead, they found Canadian troops who'd improvised protection and were still fighting. Pegamagabo shot methodically at the advancing Germans, working his bolt-action rifle with practiced speed, dropping one target after another. He fired perhaps 60 rounds. During that attack, and later estimates suggested he'd killed or wounded at least 20 German soldiers personally, slowing their advance enough that Canadian reinforcements could arrive and plug the gap. He earned his first decoration, the Military Medal, for his actions at Ypres, though the citation didn't mention his sniping specifically. It praised his courage under fire and his effectiveness as a scout. The medal meant little to Pegamagabo personally. He didn't fight for decorations or recognition, but his commander's growing respect meant they gave him more autonomy, more opportunity to operate the way he knew was most effective. By late 1915, Pegamagabo was essentially an independent operator, taking assignments to scout German positions or eliminate specific targets. then executing those missions using whatever methods he judged best. The Somme offensive in summer 1916 was industrial-scale slaughter, British and French forces attacking heavily, fortified German positions, and suffering casualties that defied comprehension. 60,000 British casualties on the first day of the battle, including 20,000 dead, the bloodiest day in British military history. The Canadians came into the Somme fighting in September 1916, thrown into attacks that ground forward meter by meter at horrific cost. Pega-Magabo fought through the Somme, but in a different way than most infantry. While battalions charged German positions in waves that got cut down by machine gun fire, Pega-Magabo worked between attacks, hunting German machine gun crews and snipers who were causing the worst casualties. He'd identify a machine gun position that was devastating Canadian attacks, study it until he understood its blind spots and angles, then work his way close enough to kill the gunners. German snipers who'd been picking off Canadian officers found themselves hunted by a Canadian sniper they couldn't locate or predict. Pega-Magabo was patient and careful, taking shots only when he was certain of the kill and certain he could escape without being spotted. His kill count climbed through the Somme, 50 confirmed kills, 75, 100. The numbers became increasingly abstract, less connected to individual moments and more a general tally of his effectiveness. He'd long since stopped thinking about each German soldier as a person with a life and story. They were targets, threats to be eliminated so that Canadian soldiers could advance and survive. This psychological distancing was necessary for him to keep functioning, but it created a growing emptiness inside him, a sense that he was losing parts of himself with each kill. Vimy Ridge, in April 1917, was supposed to be the Canadian Corps' proving ground, the battle where Canadians would demonstrate they were elite troops capable of accomplishing what British and French forces had failed to achieve. The ridge was a heavily fortified German position that dominated the surrounding terrain, and Allied forces had been trying to take it for years. Canadian commanders planned meticulously, training troops on mock-ups of the German trenches, coordinating artillery support with unprecedented precision, giving every soldier specific objectives and backup objectives in case the plan fell apart. Pega-Magabo's role at Vimy was different from most infantry. He was assigned to advance ahead of the main assault waves, eliminating German observation posts and snipers that could disrupt the attack. The night before the assault, he moved into no man's land with 2 other scouts, crawling through mud and wire in darkness toward German forward positions. They reached a shell crater about 200 yards from the German trenches and settled in to wait for the barrage that would signal the attack's beginning. The bombardment started at 5:30 in the morning, thousands of artillery pieces firing simultaneously, the noise so overwhelming that Pega-Magabo felt it through his whole body rather than just hearing it. The ground shook. The air pressure changed. Shell after shell slammed into German positions, obliterating trenches and bunkers and everything in them. Pega-Magabo watched through the smoke and fire for targets that survived the barrage, Germans who emerged from deep bunkers to man defensive positions. He saw a German machine gun crew setting up their weapon in the ruins of a trench, 4 men working frantically to get the gun operational before Canadian infantry arrived. Pega-Magabo aimed at the gunner, the most important target, and fired. The German fell. The loader grabbed the gun to take over. Pega-Magabo fired again, another German down. The remaining 2 crew members dove for cover. Pega-Magabo waited, knowing they'd have to emerge eventually to retrieve the weapon or face their own officer's wrath for abandoning their position. One German appeared cautiously, reaching for the machine gun. Pega-Magabo fired. The German collapsed. The last crew member fled. The machine gun sat abandoned, useless, no longer a threat to Canadian troops advancing up the slope. Pega-Magabo and his fellow scouts moved forward with the assault waves, identifying targets and eliminating them, clearing paths for the infantry behind them. By the end of the first day, Canadian forces had taken most of their objectives, a stunning success that exceeded even optimistic predictions. Pega-Magabo had fired perhaps 50 rounds during the battle and estimated he'd killed at least 15 Germans, though in the chaos of major combat, precise counts were impossible. What mattered was that machine guns and snipers that should have slaughtered Canadian infantry had been silenced, that officers who should have been coordinating German defenses had been killed before they could organize resistance. For his actions at Vimy and throughout the spring campaigns, Pega-Magabo received a bar to his military seal medal, a second decoration recognizing his exceptional service. The citation mentioned his effectiveness as a scout and his courage in carrying messages under fire, roles he performed in addition to his sniping. But the full scope of his contributions wasn't documented in official records. The Army didn't publicize snipers the way it publicized heroic charges or dramatic last stands. Sniping was seen as ungentlemanly, a form of warfare that civilized nations were supposed to find distasteful even as they employed it extensively. So Pegamagabo's achievements remained largely unknown outside his battalion, known to officers who valued his skills but not celebrated in newspapers or propaganda. Passchendaele in autumn 1917 was hell in ways that exceeded even the Somme horrors. The battle was fought through Belgian fields that had been destroyed by years of shelling, turning the landscape into a swamp where men drowned in mud-filled shell craters. Rain fell constantly. The ground couldn't drain. Soldiers advanced through waist-deep mud while German machine guns cut them down, and artillery turned the landscape into a moonscape of overlapping craters. Casualties were catastrophic. Gains were measured in yards purchased with thousands of lives. Pegamagabo fought through Passchendaele from late October through early November, operating as a scout and sniper in conditions that seemed designed to make both roles impossible. How do you move quietly through sucking mud? How do you find cover in terrain that's completely flat and featureless? How do you take precise shots when you're constantly soaked and shivering and covered in filth? Pegamagabo found ways, adapted his techniques to the specific challenges of this nightmare battlefield. He learned to use shell craters as firing positions, learned to time his movements to German artillery patterns, learned to shoot in rain and fog and conditions that would have made most snipers give up. His kill count climbed past 200 during Passchendaele, 225, 250. Each number represented a choice to pull the trigger, a German soldier who'd been in Pegamagabo's sights and was now dead. The psychological weight of this was enormous, but Pegamagabo had developed coping mechanisms. He focused on the military necessity of each kill, on the Canadian lives he was saving by eliminating German gunners and officers. He reminded himself that this was war, that these Germans were trying to kill Canadians just as hard as he was trying to kill them. And he drew on Anishinaabe spiritual traditions, privately conducting ceremonies to honor the dead and asking forgiveness for taking life even in war. Germany's spring offensive in 1918 was a massive gamble, a final attempt to win the war before American forces arrived in overwhelming numbers. The Germans abandoned their defensive strategy and attacked, using new infiltration tactics and specialized stormtroop units to break through Allied lines. The offensive initially succeeded, pushing British and French forces back dozens of miles, creating panic in Allied headquarters. Canadian forces were rushed to threatened sectors, deployed piecemeal to plug gaps and hold crucial positions. Pegamagabo fought through the spring crisis as part of rearguard actions and hasty defenses, using his skills to slow German advances and protect retreating Canadian units. This was different from his usual methodical sniping, requiring quick shots at moving targets and constant relocation as positions became untenable. He carried messages between units when communications broke down, running through German fire to deliver orders that kept battalions from being surrounded and destroyed. For this work during the spring crisis, he earned a second bar to his military medal, making him one of the most decorated Indigenous soldiers in Canadian military history. By summer 1918, the German offensive had exhausted itself and the Allies counterattacked, beginning the 100 Days Offensive that would end the war. Canadian forces spearheaded many of these attacks, using lessons learned from 3 years of brutal warfare to develop tactics that combined infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft into effective combined arms operations. Pegamagabo participated in these final offensives, continuing his role as scout and sniper, continuing to eliminate German defenders, even as it became increasingly obvious that Germany was collapsing. His final confirmed kill came on November 10, 1918, less than 24 hours before the armistice that would end the fighting. He was in a shell crater observing German positions when he spotted an officer examining a map, exposed for perhaps 10 seconds. Pegamagabo aimed, fired, and saw the officer fall. Kill number 547. He would never know the name of that German officer, would never know if he had a family or what he'd done before the war. Just another enemy soldier who'd made the mistake of being visible when Pegamagabo was watching. When the war ended on November 11th at 11 in the morning, Pegamagabo was still in the trenches with his battalion, still holding his rifle, still prepared to fight even though everyone knew the armistice was coming. The exact moment when fighting stopped felt anticlimactic after 4 years of continuous combat. One moment, men were dying. The next moment, everyone stopped shooting. The silence was shocking after years of constant artillery and gunfire. Pegamagabo set down his rifle and tried to process what it meant that the war was over, that he'd survived when so many hadn't, that he could stop killing now. The official record credits Pegamagabo with 378 confirmed kills, making him the most effective sniper in Canadian military history, and among the most successful snipers of World War I from any nation. But many military historians believe the actual number was significantly higher, possibly exceeding 500, because many of his kills occurred during chaotic battles where precise documentation was impossible. The number 547 appears in some sources and has become the generally accepted estimate, though the exact total will never be known with certainty. What's certain is that Pegamagabo killed more enemy soldiers than almost any other individual Canadian combatant in the war. He did it using skills he'd learned as a fisherman and hunter on Georgian Bay, traditional Anishinaabe knowledge applied to modern warfare with devastating effectiveness. German soldiers who died at his hands never saw him, never knew he was there until the bullet hit. He was a ghost in no man's land, a phantom sniper that German forces feared but couldn't counter. Pegamagabo returned to Canada in March 1919, landing in Halifax and taking the train back to Ontario, back to Parry Island and Georgian Bay, and the life he'd left in August 1914. But he returned to a country that hadn't changed its attitudes toward Indigenous people despite their service and sacrifice. Indigenous veterans weren't given the same benefits as white veterans. They faced discrimination in employment and housing. The government that had been happy to use Indigenous soldiers in war reverted to policies of cultural suppression and marginalization in peace. Pegamagabo found civilian life almost impossible to navigate after 4 years of constant combat. He'd seen and done things that separated him from people who'd stayed home, experiences that couldn't be explained or shared. He had what we'd now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1919 they called it shell shock and offered virtually no treatment. The nightmares were constant. The hypervigilance never turned off. Loud noises sent him diving for cover. He drank, heavily trying to numb the memories and the guilt of surviving when so many friends hadn't. He went back to fishing on Georgian Bay, trying to reclaim the life he'd known before the war. But fishing required patience and calm that he no longer possessed. The skills that had made him a deadly sniper, the ability to focus intensely and wait motionless for hours, these same skills now felt like curses. He'd see movement in the forest, and his body would react before his mind could process that this was Canada, not France, that those weren't German soldiers but deer or birds. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in war made peacetime feel like constant threat. He became active in Indigenous rights advocacy, fighting against government policies that oppressed First Nations communities. He served as chief of his band and worked with other Indigenous leaders to resist cultural suppression and demand recognition of treaty rights. This work gave him purpose and helped channel his experiences toward something constructive. He spoke about the contradiction of Indigenous soldiers fighting for democracy overseas while being denied basic rights at home, challenging Canada to live up to the principles it claimed to defend. But Pegamagabo rarely spoke about his war service or his achievements as a sniper. When people asked about the war, he'd give brief answers and change the subject. The medals sat in a drawer, taken out only when official events required wearing them. He didn't want to be celebrated for killing, didn't want his legacy to be the 547 deaths he'd caused. He wanted to be remembered for his work defending Indigenous rights, for his efforts to preserve Anishinaabe culture and language, for his resistance against government oppression. He died in 1952 at age 61, his body worn out by the physical and psychological toll of 4 years of combat and decades of struggling with its aftermath. His obituary in local newspapers mentioned his war service and decorations, but focused more on his leadership in the Indigenous community. The Canadian military barely acknowledged his death. There was no state funeral, no elaborate ceremony, no recognition that Canada had lost one of its most accomplished soldiers. He was buried in a small cemetery on Parry Island, a simple grave marker with his name and dates, no mention of the hundreds of enemy soldiers he'd killed, or the military medal with 2 bars that made him one of Canada's most decorated veterans. For decades, Pegamagabo remained largely forgotten outside of Indigenous communities and military history specialists. Canadian military history tended to focus on white officers and dramatic battles, not on Indigenous snipers who'd fought with exceptional skill, but hadn't fit the heroic narratives that dominated remembrance. The full scope of his accomplishments wasn't widely known or celebrated. That began to change in the late 20th century as Historians started paying more attention to Indigenous contributions to Canada's military history. Researchers discovered the documentation of Pega service and realized they were looking at one of the most effective snipers in Canadian history, a soldier whose achievements rivaled or exceeded the most famous snipers from any nation. Books and articles began to be written about him. Military historians studied his techniques. Indigenous communities celebrated him as a hero who'd proven the courage and capability of First Nations people, while also recognizing the tragedy of a warrior who'd been used by a country that didn't respect his people. In 2008, the Canadian government finally recognized Pega service properly, posthumously inducting him into the Canadian Military Hall of Honor. In 2016, a new naval vessel was named HMCS Pega in his honor, the first Canadian warship named after an Indigenous person. These recognitions came far too late for Pega himself, but they represented Canada beginning to acknowledge Indigenous veterans and their contributions to the country's military history. The legacy of Francis Pega is complex and multifaceted. He was an extraordinarily effective soldier who used traditional Indigenous knowledge to become the most successful Canadian sniper in World War I. He killed hundreds of enemy soldiers with skill and precision that German forces couldn't counter. But he was also a man who suffered immensely from his war experiences, who struggled with trauma and marginalization, who returned to a country that used him in war but oppressed him in peace. He was a leader who fought for Indigenous rights and cultural preservation, who challenged Canada to live up to its stated values. And he was a human being who carried the weight of 547 deaths for the rest of his life, deaths that were militarily necessary but psychologically crushing. His story reveals truths about war and sacrifice that comfortable narratives often obscure. Indigenous soldiers like Pega fought for a country that didn't grant them full citizenship, that suppressed their culture and violated their treaties. They volunteered to defend democracy while being denied democratic rights themselves. They proved their courage and capability repeatedly, only to face continued discrimination when they returned home. Pega embodied this contradiction, a decorated war hero who couldn't vote until 1960 when Canada finally extended the franchise to First Nations people living on reserves. The question of why Pega enlisted and fought so effectively has no simple answer. He left no memoir explaining his motivations. We have only the actions documented in military records and the memories preserved in his community. Perhaps he fought because he believed in defending freedom even if Canada hadn't extended that freedom to him. Perhaps he fought to prove that Indigenous people were as capable and courageous as anyone, demanding respect through martial achievement. Perhaps he fought simply because it was a job that needed doing and he had skills that made him effective at it. Likely his motivations were complex and shifted over time, evolving through 4 years of combat and killing. What's undeniable is that Francis Pega was one of the most effective combat soldiers Canada has ever produced. He killed more enemy soldiers than almost any other individual Canadian combatant, using skills rooted in Anishinaabe hunting and fishing traditions. German soldiers who died at his hands never saw him coming, never had a chance to return fire or take cover. He was a phantom in no man's land, a patient hunter who understood terrain and timing and marksmanship at levels that formal military training couldn't match. His achievements should have made him a Canadian military legend, celebrated and studied and honored. Instead, he spent most of his life forgotten or ignored, his contributions erased by a society that didn't value Indigenous soldiers, no matter how effectively they fought. The 547 confirmed kills stand as a testament to his skill and dedication, but also as a reminder of war's human cost. Each of those numbers represented a person, a German soldier, who had his own story and reasons for being in the trenches, who had family and friends, and a life that ended because Pega pulled a trigger. He understood this. The weight of those deaths never left him. Even when advocating for Indigenous rights in the decades after the war, even when fighting against government oppression and cultural suppression, Pega carried the memory of 547 lives he'd taken. That burden shaped who he became, influenced how he saw the world, and informed his determination that Indigenous youth should have opportunities beyond warfare, that they should be able to live in peace with their culture and rights respected. Francis Pega died in 1952, but his legacy continues to resonate. He represents the best of Canadian military tradition, courage, and skill and dedication to mission. But he also represents the worst of Canadian civil tradition, the marginalization and oppression of Indigenous people who served their country with distinction, but received discrimination in return. His story challenges Canada to reckon with this contradiction, to acknowledge that the same nation that relied on Indigenous soldiers in war denied them justice in peace. And his story reminds us that behind every military statistic, every kill count and casualty figure are human beings who made choices and paid prices that echoed through the rest of their lives. The Fisherman from Georgian Bay became the deadliest sniper in Canadian history, and none of the 547 German soldiers he killed ever saw who was shooting. That achievement deserves recognition. But the man who bore that achievement's weight deserves to be remembered as more than just a killer, as a leader and advocate and human being who struggled with trauma and injustice, but never stopped fighting for what he believed was right.